Welcome to People in Profit. I'm Kate Moody. Coming up, the global economy is beginning to recover from the coronavirus pandemic, but what does that mean for the world's workers? We'll hear from the International Labour Organization about the challenges ahead. The cost of education in the United States, why so many students graduate with huge piles of debt, and what's being done about it. And return of the slippers. The cozy traditional footwear is back in vogue and back in business. A year after the coronavirus crisis was declared a pandemic, the rollout of vaccines and ongoing fiscal support have set the stage for a strong economic recovery. The OECD has boosted its forecast for 2021. It expects global GDP to expand 5.6% this year. That's 1.4% higher than its previous outlook. The Eurozone is expected to grow 3.9% and the US 6.5%, with China and India on track to be the fastest growing economies in the world. But risks remain. The OECD's chief economist, Laurence Boone, has told France 24 that certain sectors are lagging behind.
Having some sectors closed is not normal for an economy. That's not a normal economic crisis. It's really the result of this pandemic. So the sectors that are closed are the one that involves physical interaction, where physical distancing is tough. So that's hospitality, it's tourism, it's large event, it's personal services, many of those. And obviously, the larger the share of those sectors in your economy, like for example, tourism in Spain, and the higher the hit to the global economy.
We're joined now by Manuela Tomei from the UN's International Labour Organization. Thanks for joining us on People in Profit. Tens of millions of people across the globe have been put out of work by the pandemic. As economic growth begins to pick up, what prospects do you see for getting them back into the labour market?
Yes, there is sign of economic recovery, but it is still very weak and uncertain. And the job recovery has been slow, even when there is a sign of economic recovery. Take the case of the US and Germany, in which indeed we have been seeing very good news in terms of the decline of the unemployment rate. But many workers have moved out of the workforce, which means that indeed we have not yet gone back to the level of employment prior to the pandemic in those countries that have seen a decline in unemployment rates. There is also the issue that those that have been the most hit by the pandemic are the low skilled and the low paid. And when we are moving to the developing countries, we see that indeed workers in the informal economy have been hit significantly. 1.6 billion of the 2 billion informal workers across the world are the ones that have suffered significant job and income losses due to the pandemic. And now that recovery is beginning slightly in some developing countries, many of even the workers that were working before the outbreak of the pandemic formally are now moving to the informal economy in order to make ends meet.
In addition to the question of lost jobs is the question of lost wages. The ILO found last year a drop of more than 8% in global income, depending on how and when the pandemic is brought under control. This year, it's expecting between 1% and 5%. How long can we expect to see this COVID effect when it comes to global wages?
There is always a lag between economic recovery and employment recovery, and I would say that the lag is even larger when we are talking of the recovery of wages. This is a fact which has been proven also by previous crises. And another very discouraging trend is that indeed the wage losses have not affected all workers equally. The impact on women and low-paid workers, those at the very bottom of the wage distribution, has been much worse than on men and those that are placed in the middle or at the top of the wage distribution.
You've alluded to this inequality that's been exposed by the pandemic in gender, in age, race, socioeconomic status. Are the most vulnerable people getting the help that they need?
The pandemic has just exposed inequalities that pre-existed and exacerbate them even further. We have seen that in a number of countries, as part of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, measures of a temporary nature have been taken with a view to alleviate the impact on women and other disadvantaged groups. The problem, however, that these are quite patchy in nature. They are of a temporary nature and very limited in scale.
The ILO has recently called for better protections for workers in the digital economy. Specifically, that's the sort of gig economy workers, people who work for platforms like Deliveroo and Uber. What specifically needs to happen?
The challenges for platform for workers relate to working conditions, regularity of work and income, lack of access to social protection, freedom of association, collective bargaining rights. What to do in order to improve their working conditions is to make sure that their employment status is correctly classified. If they are employees, they should be defined as such and treated accordingly. It's very important to also ensure transparency and accountability of the algorithm that are being used in order also to deactivate or to let workers and businesses in, and this in the interest of both workers and businesses. It's very important that also those workers that are independent contractors enjoy the right to bargain collectively, and that they may be able to have access to adequate social security benefits through the adaptation of policy and legal frameworks where this may be necessary. And last but not least, it's very important to provide for wage protection and ensure that indeed the wages that are due to them for their services are properly paid and in a timely manner.
Manuela Tomei from the International Labour Organization, thanks so much for joining us. The latest U.S. stimulus package aims to protect American businesses and households still struggling to cope with the pandemic. The bill also includes a provision to eliminate taxes on canceled student debt. It could pave the way to fulfilling one of President Joe Biden's campaign pledges, relief on $10,000 worth of individuals' student loans. Some Democrats want him to go even further, up to $50,000 per graduate, but that's not on the cards for now. Brian Quinn is here with a bit of an education on this issue. Brian, just how much do American students owe?
Well, Kate, there are currently around 45 million American student loan borrowers, and their debt has been steadily rising for the past 15 years, from around $500 billion in 2006 to over $1.7 trillion today. Student loans are now the second largest source of U.S. household debt, just behind mortgages and ahead of credit card debt.
Is this a uniquely American problem?
Well, America is a standout case, but it's not completely alone. The UK, for example, actually has higher average student debt. For most of Europe, university tuition is often either free or heavily subsidized. French public universities, for example, charge around 170 euros per term for a basic undergrad program. In any case, no other country comes close to that $1.7 trillion figure, and there are a few reasons for that. One is tuition costs, which have shot up in the past 3 decades, more than doubling for private colleges and tripling for public ones. More and more lower-income Americans are borrowing to go to college, and parents, too, are taking on more education debt. Their borrowing has tripled over the past 25 years.
So is forgiving all this debt really the best way to tackle the problem?
There is a case for it. Just $10,000 in debt forgiveness would wipe out the debt of around 15 million student borrowers. Forgiving $50,000 would cancel the balances of more than twice as many federal borrowers and cut overall student debt by $1 trillion. That could, in turn, help boost the economy. One of the biggest arguments against debt forgiveness is that it could essentially be a giveaway to higher income borrowers who hold the largest balances. Proponents, though, say any level of debt forgiveness will help to close the racial wealth gap as Black students face a much heavier debt burden than their white counterparts.
Brian Quinn, thanks so much for that update. Well, lockdowns around the world have sparked a shift in consumer and fashion trends. Here in France, the traditional Charentaise slipper has seen a rebound and a new chapter in its 300-year-old history. Andrew Hillier has more.
the Charentaise, a slipper whose legendary comfort has turned it into a global brand. Already in the 1960s, a dozen factories in the French department of Charente were churning out thousands of slippers to a worldwide market. Fast forward half a century later, when in 2019 the last French factory shut its doors, crumbling under fierce competition from Asia. But now, Olivier Rondineau has restarted production in this tiny warehouse. His family has been making Charentaise slippers for 4 generations, and there's never been any question of abandoning a family tradition.
Everything you see here are items that have just been made. They'll be sent off either today or tomorrow at the latest, depending on delivery constraints.
His big idea is to stick to traditional methods. That means using no glue to hold the sole in place and stitching it before then turning the slipper inside out to guarantee its level of comfort. In her 40 years on the job, Martine Virola has lived through 3 factory closures. This reopening is a godsend for her.
I've reached a certain age where it's not easy to find work. On top of that, this is all I've done throughout my career. All I know are shoes. So this was a stroke of luck for me. I'm very happy.
The sewing machines are some 50 years old and impossible to find elsewhere. Olivier Rondineau had no choice but to learn how to repair them.
A machine part has fallen off, so I have to put it back on. And unfortunately, to do that, I have to take everything apart.
Coronavirus has helped boost his factory's fortunes in no small part. With lockdowns and curfews obliging people to spend their evenings at home, demand for these slippers has gone through the roof. And customers have little doubt as to the quality of the final product. Made in France, the Charentaise has made its comeback.
That's all for this week, but don't forget you can find all our previous shows on our website, france24.com. And you can get in touch on social media with your comments and questions. Until next time, thanks for watching.
Special events.
10 years of conflict in Syria have had devastating effects on neighboring countries. Lebanon has had to take in 1.5 million refugees in a country already battling economic crisis and sectarian tensions. Do not miss our series of special reports. It's on France 24 and France24.com.
Watch events unfold on France 24 and France24.com.